Okay, welcome to the 29th Virtual History of 2021, presented by the Baltimore Architecture Foundation and Baltimore Heritage. This is Nathan Denny's, Associate Director of the BAF. After a summer break, we are back with Virtual Histories now lined up through October. Thank you to everyone who donated to be with us today. Your support allows us to host these Virtual Histories nearly every week. And before we get started, we have a few announcements. Next week, Philip Lord will be joining us for a presentation on Cockeysville marble. If you've been in Baltimore or seen the Washington Monument in DC, you have seen this marble. Phil will tell the stories of the quarries like Beaver Dam and share some famous buildings where the marble was used. The following week, historian Louis Diggs will be discussing Underground Railroad sites in Baltimore County as part of International Underground Railroad Month. And finally, we are so excited to kick off Doors Open Baltimore with Dr. Lawrence Brown, author of The Black Butterfly. And also, if you're interested in seeing the lineup for Doors Open Baltimore, we have programs all throughout October, and you can see the full lineup at www.doorsopenbaltimore.org. Now, today, we're joined by Ed Pappenfuse. Ed is the retired Maryland State Archivist and chair of the Baltimore City Historical Society Board. Ed is also a member of the BAF Dead Architects Society, where he has been working with the committee on establishing a wiki for Maryland's architectural history. Ed, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Welcome to my study. It's a pleasure for me to be with you all this afternoon. This is a story about a house and about a family that occupied the house, as well as the family that they sold the house to. It's a story about an individual who was famous in the annals of the spies who resided in America. His name was Whittaker Chambers. And if I may, I'd like to begin with Whittaker Chambers' own observations about how much he and his wife Esther loved Baltimore. My wife and I had come to love Baltimore above all cities. We were at home in it, finding in its kindly people and their quiet lives a tranquility contrasting with our distress. We loved the physical city, its old brick houses and whose grave and fine proportions we sensed the proportions of a soul as well as an architecture. We loved its moods of morning and of evening light, its long gardens, sometimes brick walled, its gas-lit streets at night. Hopefully you can all see the shared screen. No matter how much evidence remains for the study of history, it takes considerable imagination to reconstruct the past into a convincing narrative. Sometimes the records are so extensive, the perspective and detachment are nearly impossible. Was Alger Hiss, 1904 to 1996, Baltimore born, Johns Hopkins educated, and a State Department employee, a spy for the Russians? Was Whittaker Chambers, 1901 to 1961, playwright, translator, self-confessed spy, ex-communist, esteemed editor at Time magazine, and a Baltimore resident, a reliable witness to proving Alger Hiss was a spy? Alger Hiss, who had risen high in the State Department and was largely responsible for organizing the San Francisco conference that led to the creation of the United Nations, went to prison in 1950, convicted of perjury, not spying, on the testimony and documents supplied by Whittaker Chambers. He denied Chambers' charges to the day he died, November 15th, 1996, at the age of 92. Was Alger Hiss guilty of treason or collaboration with Russia? The question remains a matter of extended debate, fueled by websites devoted to the lives of both Alger Hiss and Whittaker Chambers. A possible theory is that Witness by Whittaker Chambers is the great American novel, one of the best examples of American historical fiction conceived and begun in Baltimore. Regardless of what conclusions the reader reaches from the mountain of evidence of the books that have been written about Alger Hiss's guilt or innocence, much of the testimony and the evidence produced by Whittaker Chambers about Hiss centers on Baltimore, where Chambers and his family, often under a number of aliases, lived in typical middle class housing, largely rental, from 1934 until 1939. From the standpoint of the Hiss case, the most important of those years was 1938, when the Chambers family lived openly at 2610 St. Paul Street. 1938 was a pivotal year for Whittaker Chambers and his family. By his own testimony early that year and the evidence presented at trial, he decided to leave the Communist Party and join the ranks of the bourgeoisie. In February, he was furloughed from his government job in Washington, D.C. as an editor with the Works Progress Administration, the National Research Project, and found it necessary to seek a permanent job. For several years, Chambers had been engaged as an on-again, off-again editor of left-wing journals and newspapers, as well as a very respected translator of several books. And in 1938-39, he was under contract with Oxford University Press as a translator. That supplied a modest income. The uncertainty of his financial affairs did not deter him and Esther, his wife, from leaving rented apartments at 2124 Mount Royal Terrace, where another famous spy, Virginia Hall, had once lived, to buying a house at 2610 St. Paul in June of 1938 as David and Esther Chambers. The new home at 2610 St. Paul Street provided a city resident to complement the farm in Carroll County on which they had placed a down payment the previous year. Where the financial resources came from to buy those two properties is a matter of debate, but it was in part made possible because the Chambers established their credit to borrow and to buy on time in Baltimore by convincing the Baltimore Credit Bureau that Whittaker Chambers was none other than J. Lee Chambers, a well-paid U.S. Treasury official. Stolen identity. If his biographer is correct, Chambers acquired the last batch of secret government documents and microfilm from his sources in Washington in April of 1938. As a security blanket intended to prove Alger Hiss was a spy, all of which he said he secreted in New York City in late 1938 or early 1939 for, quote, insurance purposes, in case he was called to account for his espionage past and to name names of government officials who were fellow travelers or outright communist spies. After losing his federal job in February 1938, because of the downsizing of his section and a short vacation in Florida, Chambers returned to his new home at 2610 St. Paul Street with translation as his primary source of income while he looked for full-time employment. During his and Esther's ownership of 2610 St. Paul Street, June of 1938 to June of 1939, it is clear that David Chambers was hard at work translating. But what else may he have been doing apart from his job hunting in New York? In late 1938, he landed a steady, well-paying job with Henry Luce as an editor at Time magazine. The documents and microfilm stashed in New York were forgotten, and the family's financial future looked bright. 10 years later, that peaceful world would fall apart, and Chambers would be called upon to explain his communist ties and his suppliers of secret government documents. Before the House Un-American Activities Committee, he would testify that Alger Hiss had been a communist who he had known well and who was a spy, ultimately producing as evidence what became known as the Pumpkin Papers and the Baltimore documents. They included typescripts of classified government documents and microfilm of originals. None of the material, typed or copy, appeared to be dated later than April of 1938. Who typed the copies? And when were they typed? The answer possibly lies within the year the Chambers family lived at 2610 St. Paul Street, the modest 19th century house in Charles Village, Baltimore. The general public's attention was first drawn to this connection with Chambers by Robert P. Harris, a reporter for the Baltimore American, in a Man About Town column he wrote on the death of Whittaker Chambers in 1961. In 1948, when Chambers went public with his accusations against Hiss at the House Un-American Activities Committee, Harris and his wife were sitting in the back garden of 2610 St. Paul. She was reading the newspaper account when she exclaimed, "Why, he was hiding right here in our home." They looked back to when they were first shown the house by Esther Chambers. They dealt directly with her and never saw Chambers. They especially remembered the basement where they had noted, quote, "a cubicle enclosed with heavy timbers, a sort of stockade, really, containing a chair, a small table, and a typewriter under a drop light." Noting my questioning look, Mrs. Chambers said, "My husband does his writing down there. He prefers to work down there." By 1961, when Harris first wrote about his encounter with Mrs. Chambers in purchasing her home, there had been a great deal written about the typewriter on which some of the incriminating evidence presented about Hiss's spying allegedly had been copied. Some scholars argued that the typist was Priscilla Hiss, thus incriminating her husband Alger. Others, including an FBI expert, dismissed the Woodstock typewriter that was introduced into evidence at Hiss's trial as not the machine on which the purloined documents were copied. Was the typewriter Harris and his wife claimed to have seen in the basement of 2610 St. Paul the typewriter on which the Baltimore Papers produced by Chambers were typed? Could that basement have been where Whittaker Chambers began to concoct and write down for future disclosure his attack on Hiss's credibility? The year the Chambers lived there, 1938 to 1939, was certainly a turning point in Whittaker Chambers' life. Henry Luce hired him as the editor for Time magazine, and he commenced full employment with a good salary based upon his editorial and translation skills. Had he already realized that he needed a watertight story of his departure from the party and accumulated evidence of nefarious activity within the State Department as an insurance policy, typing the transcripts himself? What did, if anything, transpire in the basement of 2610 St. Paul Street? Until the investigators for Hiss began digging into the life of Whittaker Chambers in the late 1940s, there was no proof that Chambers or his wife had ever owned 2610 St. Paul. The official land records of the day record no sale to the Chambers or from the Chambers to Harris. The official record of the sale in June of 1939 was from Henry Momberger to Robert P. Harris. Momberger had owned 2610 St. Paul since 1930 when he purchased it from a widow. In 1938, Momberger and the Chambers signed an off-the-record contract for the sale of the house. In searching for ownership of housing in Baltimore, unrecorded contracts of sale get in the way of knowing who actually occupied the premises at a given point in time. Such contracts included a down payment, modifications to the house and grounds required by the buyer, and periodic payments with interest until the full purchase price was paid. At that point, the official deed would be recorded among the land records of the city and not before. On the 11th day of June, 1938, Esther and David Chambers signed an unrecorded standard contract of sale with Henry Momberger to buy 2610 St. Paul, with the agreement by Momberger to build a one-car brick garage at the rear of the lot, create a closed closet and a passageway adjoining the bathroom, repair the broken shutters, and replace broken window panes. The Chambers paid $200 down on a sale price of $2,950, can you imagine? And agreed to
conditions of paying the remainder plus interest that may have included an additional payment of $1,000 borrowed from Chambers' mother, Laha. Not until the Hiss's investigators obtained the contract in October of 1948 was the proof obtained that Chambers had agreed to buy the house. By October 1948, the contract with the Chambers had been transferred to the Harrises, with the sale recorded in the land records of the city as having occurred on the 29th day of June, 1939. June 1938 to June 1939 was a busy year for the Chambers, who at last had the prospect of a steady income other than Esther's possible salary at Park School, where she was an assistant to the art teacher, a job that she had begun while they were living in an apartment on Alcantara Terrace across from Druid Hill Park, near to the site of the first location of Park School. In June of 1938, the Chambers moved from their apartment on Mont Royal Terrace to their new home at 2610 St. Paul Street. A year later, after the sale to the Harrises, the Chambers moved permanently from St. Paul Street to a farm in Carroll County, the scene of the microfilm and the pumpkin patch in 1948, which catapulted Richard Nixon to the presidency. Once again, there is no official record of initiating the purchase of the Carroll County property until 1940, when the Chambers had sufficient funds to complete the sale, a sale that had begun not with the Chambers, but with an interest in the farm expressed by Priscilla Hiss. The Baltimore Papers, or Pumpkins Papers as they collectively were called, broke the Hiss case wide open. They consisted of documents covering the period from December 1937 until April 1938, including handwritten notes in Hiss's hand from a cable sent from Moscow on January 28, 1938. The remainder were typescripts of documents allegedly produced on a Woodstock typewriter written by Priscilla Hiss for Whittaker Chambers before April of 1938, when Chambers deposed that he had broken with the Communist Party, typescripts that he said he stashed away instead of delivering them to his communist contact in 1938, in case he ever needed to prove his break with the Communist Party and identify those with whom he collaborated, specifically the Hisses. Chambers did not at first disclose the microfilm seen in this classic photograph of Richard Nixon and HUAC counsel Robert Stripling. That would come later in the pumpkin patch at the Carroll County farm. Of great interest were the typescripts, which were of confidential or allegedly secret department documents. Who had typed them and what typewriter had been used? Did they indeed implicate Priscilla and Alger Hiss, or were they typed at 2610 St. Paul Street by Chambers, a part of an elaborate scheme on his part to use Hiss as a means of ensuring his reputation as a fearless foe of communism and as fodder for one of the finest pieces of fiction ever written by an American? As John P. Marquand pointed out in the blurb he authored for Witness as a Book of the Month Club selection in 1952, quote, "No psychological novel can exceed it in interest. No study of conflicting character under stress could go deeper with Chambers or be more puzzling than with Hiss. The book was not written as literature, but literature it is of a high order. Did the writing of what may have been a psychological novel of its own take shape in the cellar of 2610 St. Paul? The facts are not to be found. Like Robert P. Harris, we are left to our imagination." Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. And everyone, if you have questions, please add them into the Q&A box or to the chat. So Ed, you've spent a lot of time researching this topic. What do you think really happened?
So that's an interesting question. I believe that the whole case against Hiss is rooted in facts that are correct, meaning that Hiss and Chambers knew each other as their wives knew each other in the period from about 1934 on through to 1938. In that period, they associated with each other. Hiss initially denied all that, saying that he never knew of Whittaker Chambers. Then when confronted with Chambers, he said, "Oh, well, I do recognize him as George Crossley." But the bottom line is the Chambers and the Hisses knew each other well until 1938. Now, when it comes to sort of looking at who was involved in sort of developing the story, I think that everybody has basically neglected Priscilla and Esther. They were, in fact, very much involved in the story. We do know that Priscilla and Esther were friends, that they shared the same pediatrician, Dr. Margaret Nicholson, that in fact, They probably were friends to the degree that they were thinking about taking some courses together, and actually Priscilla enhancing her own ability to have her own independent life and independent income. We'll never know all of that for sure. But what is very interesting about this whole business is that nothing really was brought out or done in relationship to this question of who Alger Hiss was associated with before 1948. And 1948 is a time of great tension in America. In fact, there's so many parallels between it and what's happening today on the political scene that I would think that a few commentators ought to pay a little bit more attention to it instead of thinking that everything actually began with 9/11. It actually began much before that, and the controversy over what the New Deal represented and what the New Deal wanted to be, and those who were definitely and very strongly opposed to the New Deal. All of the business of what Chambers begins to assert about Hiss and the story he tells doesn't come out until 1948. That's after Roosevelt has died. That's when Joe McCarthy is getting underway. It is when the House Un-American Activities Committee is trying to root out communists wherever they find them. And it is a period of great tension. So if you ask me, what do I believe that in fact Whittaker Chambers in Witness creates really tremendous historical fiction based upon facts, as most good historical fiction does. Was Hiss guilty of being a spy? It was never proven in court. What was proven in court was that he had lied about knowing Whittaker Chambers. And that was the perjury. And that was the perjury that got him sent to prison. And ever after that, he spent a great deal of time trying to make it clear that he was really unfairly imprisoned and that he had never been a spy. So that's a long answer to your short question.
Well, I'll ask you another question, which you had a slide with Richard Nixon. How important was this trial to Richard Nixon's political career?
Absolutely fundamental. I mean, this is where he really shows himself to be an opponent of communism. And, you know, when he runs for political office in California, he uses the red baiting approach to unseat his opponent. He is a crafty fellow who really uses this as the cornerstone of his career as it approached his attempts to become president of the United States. Eventually were successful. And he always, I mean, when he talked about the great crises that he writes about, this is one of the paramount crises that he flatters himself that he had a lot to do with making public and pursuing the evil that it actually represented.
Well, there's no shortage of politicians accusing others of being communists today either. So
that's true. And of course, the question is, what does that mean?
Yeah. Well, it doesn't look like we have any questions coming into the chat here. If anyone does have a question, you can enter it into the chat or to the Q&A box, or maybe Eddie just does such a thorough job of this talk that anyone is.
Well, let me make it very clear that I very much encourage dissent, and I would be very happy to hear from those who feel quite differently about what I presented and how I presented it.
Yeah, well, going a little bit off topic, you mentioned another spy who, can you talk about her?
Oh, well, a lot has been written lately about Virginia Hall. She was a remarkable woman. While she was living at Mount Royal Terrace in that house at that point was not made into apartments. It was a private family dwelling. And as a teenager, she lived in that house and attended school at Roland Park Country School. She goes on to be a very important aspect of the spy apparatus for the United States in France. She loses her leg in the process. She is awarded all kinds of awards and a recognition, which, by the way, she couldn't make public for a fairly long period of time, even though her mother was featured in a newspaper article contemporary that suggests that her daughter was up to such activities abroad. Other than that, she was really a very brilliant woman. Somebody really should pay a little bit more attention to the women and all of the stories that relate to this period of time. Esther Chambers is a remarkable intellect who studied at Yale. Priscilla is a remarkable intellect who was really stifled in their career because of the dominance of men throughout this whole period. So I'm encouraging somebody along the way to begin looking a little bit more closely, not just at the heroines, which Hall represents, but also those women who were basically struggling to make a place in this world, but were really not able to do anything more than be shown their associations with men who had part in the controversies of that period. My 2 cents.
Great, yeah, and I definitely agree with that. Women have been so overshadowed by the men in the telling of these stories.
Well, the part of the problem is, of course, the stories have all been told by men,
Yes.
with the exception of Joan Brady, whose book I really don't like. So I'll make that very clear. She basically went after her topic, which the thesis I have some agreement with, but she went after a topic by hiring all these researchers and then complaining that they weren't able to get to all the documentation that you really wanted to see. Well, I don't think that accomplished very much as a result. So.
Okay, we do have some questions coming in here.
Good.
One is, was there any evidence of suspicion that Chambers was a communist?
Oh, yes, without a doubt. He wrote for the New Masses. His party affiliation, I think, was made very clear in the trial. I think what really is interesting is what brings him to move from his communist involvement to becoming a part of the, let's say, the Republican bourgeoisie, which he really does become a part of when he moves to Time magazine. I think a lot of it has to do with tensions within the communist world itself. It has to do with the fact that there were an awful lot of communists who were really dissatisfied with the purge, with Stalin, and the whole approach that Stalin was making to communism and the leadership he was providing. I think it also has to do with the fact that the communists within the United States were under siege, given a slight respite during World War II when we were actually allies with Soviet Russia, but comes back with a vengeance in 1945, 46, 47, and 48. So you can see, I think, in Chambers's career of wanting to really express himself and be a part of this intellectual movement that was really related to communist theory, communism, socialism, a mixture of both, writing very well on it, translating some remarkable works from the German, for example. I mean, this man was versatile in terms of the number of languages he knew. I mean, most of us, I think, grew up with Bambi, especially the presentation of Bambi by Walt Disney. And of course, Bambi and that translation that was used was done by Whittaker Chambers, from which he made a certain amount of income. So when you come to 1938, 39, there's a little uneasiness. He's got one child, he's got another child on the way. What's he going to do for a permanent source of income? He was a very bright guy. He begins to look at what his other options are. And his other options are still to stay in the editorial world, to stay in the writing world. You know, when he goes to Time magazine and he becomes the editor of the pages that they do every year honoring people, you know, the Time Man of the Year, then it became the Time Person of the Year. The editor of those was Whittaker Chambers. And the only one of his editors that Henry Luce acknowledges as doing such a good job with those pages. In fact, there's a whole piece that was written by Chambers about how well he was doing the Man of the Year pages. There's a respectability and a source of income that comes to him that way that he couldn't get any other way. And I think that's part of it. Now, there are all kinds of theories about his direct relationship with Alger Hiss, not the least of which was a distraught lover who was not appreciated by Alger Hiss. So there's a stress and a fair amount of the literature on, which is very sad actually, on Chambers' homosexuality. Well, that may be some of the reason why he chose Hiss as his safety valve, but I really doubt it. I think it's more likely that what he was doing in terms of gathering data and writing, trying to make associations within government, Hiss became a very sort of clearly prime object that he could deal with. And so that's what he does. But that's my theory. I think many people would say I'm welcome to it.
We have a few.
Okay, whatever. I'll keep my answers briefer. I wasn't sure.
Oh yeah, no, you're fine. You're fine. We have a few comments from some of your past students. Edie Sanford says she took your class in the early '90s at Hopkins. We also have a question from Sandy. He says, Ed, please talk about Venona and whether we should believe that Ailes was really Alger or not. Your devoted student, Ailes Jr.
Okay, this is a hugely controversial issue because the federal government, the FBI, had the ability to sort of snoop the Russian embassy and to capture the cables that went out of the Russian embassy. And they had a whole team of people, including a very fairly well-known Baltimorean who was assigned to sort of look at these cables. Well, the whole question of Ailes doesn't come up until Nixon is president of the United States. And all of a sudden, the FBI writes a footnote to its transcripts, which it had a great deal of difficulty coping with in the first place, translating them, really understanding what they had to say. Yes, Ailes is mentioned. And the footnote says Ailes must have been Alger Hiss. Well, there's no proof that Ailes was in fact Alger Hiss, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest he was somebody else. This is one example of the uncertainty of evidence that is utilized on both sides of the argument to say that they're telling the truth. And yet it doesn't prove anything. Okay, it only proves that the FBI had access to cables, some of which, by the way, they couldn't even figure out what they were saying. So it's a dicey business, but a lot's been written about it. Venona, I mean, there is a librarian at the Library of Congress who is exceptionally good at looking at the whole history of communism from a, let's just say, a right perspective, who was convinced that no, I'm misspeaking, but at any rate, that these documents were in fact accurate in pointing to Alger Hiss. They also pointed, by the way, to Donald Hiss, and that's another story altogether. They were said to have pointed to Donald Hiss. Now, to be fair to Chambers, I want to back up on something that is really important to say in terms of his pointing to people within the government who had communist associations. He does depose in between 1938 and 1940 that he knew a number of people in government who were associated with communists, fellow travelers, possibly communists themselves. And both Alger Hiss's and Donald Hiss's names occur in that list. All right. So it's evidence to me that he was beginning to think about what his escape hatch was going to be. But I want to make it clear that Chambers does take this information to the State Department
before 1948.
Yeah, I think we'll have two more questions here.
Sure.
One is, why did William Marbury Sr. resign as Chambers' lawyer?
Well, in the Catbird Seat, which he wrote as his memoirs, he basically implies because he believed that Hiss did have an association with Chambers through Priscilla. And he believes that it was impossible to determine whether or not Hiss was partnered with Priscilla in making the transcripts, meaning he brought them home, Priscilla typed them, passed them on to Chambers, or whether in fact Priscilla literally did this on her own from things that which her husband came home and left behind. He basically wanted to wash his hands of having anything to do with it. Richard Cleveland, on the other hand, kept his hand in, and he was the lawyer for the Chambers. And in fact, it's Cleveland who is present at the point at which Marbury is just flabbergasted by what is pulled out of the elevator shaft, so it was said, in New York, which formed the Baltimore Papers. Now, those Baltimore Papers were transcripts and notes in Hiss's handwriting, right? The microfilm doesn't show up until it's pulled out of a pumpkin in Carroll County. So we've got two sets of documentation: Baltimore Papers, pumpkin papers.
And do the pumpkin papers include State Department secrets?
Well, it depends on whether or not you believe either side of the story. What they were copies of innocuous assessments of military activity and proposals for doing things to reinforce various aspects of the Navy, for example, which could only have come from State Department files. And so whether they were secret documents, whether they were things which really should not have been circulated, they certainly were a part of a set of documents that the State Department considered ought not to be made public. And so that's, you can go on and on with regard to that, but I think the answer is very straightforward. The microfilm contains documents that were purloined somewhere in just before April of 1938. We come back to this whole argument. All the documentation that is provided by Chambers is pre-move to 2610 St. Paul Street. So take the story from there.
And okay, last one is, can you tell us about the open book you have there next to you?
The open book is what I think pulled Chambers into Hiss's orbit. This is a story written by a very well-known Baltimore reporter by the name of Beverly Smith. And Beverly Smith wrote this wonderful article about the young men who were drawn to Washington, D.C. to participate in the New Deal. Hiss is featured in the article. And he is praised for being one of these new voices of the New Deal. It is interesting that the testimony about when Hiss first meets Chambers, whether he met him as Crossley or whether he met him as Chambers, was that he came to Hiss saying he wanted to write another article for the American. So I've always thought that this particular article by Beverly Smith was in fact a really important piece of the story. But there's a very interesting, intriguing mystery to all of this. Neither Harris nor Beverly Smith ever mentioned an association with Chambers prior to 1948. And in fact, Beverly Smith never talked about it, as far as I know, though he may have discussed it with some of the reporters at The Sun. He may have actually talked with other people who were associated with Hiss, because he was more on the Hiss side of the story. Harris, a little bit more favorable until he grew a little bit. Well, he's favorable to Chambers in terms of his conservative approach to things. So anyway, that's the reason why I have this on display. The other pile here are all of the books that I gleaned the story of 2610 from the standpoint of the people who have written about Hiss and Chambers.
Well, thank you, Ed. This was a really fascinating presentation. And I hope that those of you who are in attendance can join us next week for the presentation on Cockeysville Marble.
Thank you very much for having me on.